Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and in this one I'm going to go over my round 1 game from the Chess Max Academy GM Invitational. Now, this tournament was actually held in the beginning of November and was actually in New York City. There's a chess academy that Grandmaster Maxim Delugi runs on the Upper East Side, and essentially it was one of the first norm tournaments he was holding, in part because the Charlotte model, if you will, has become so popular. So essentially, if you've been following the series, you know that I actually have played in Charlotte in some of these GMIM Invitationals quite a bit. And essentially, the way that tournament model works is you have a bunch of norm seekers, and then, so you have 6 norm seekers and then 3 grandmasters, and you put a closed section together where the norm scores 6.5 out of 9. And the norm seekers are actually paying pretty decent sums of money to play in these tournaments and try to get norms, whereas the grandmasters that play in them are compensated for their time because, they obviously care about their rating, but they no longer are norm seekers. And so there's actually been such demand for these norm events in the United States that now other organizers are starting to catch on, and Max Delugi was no different. So anyways, without further ado, let me get into actually this game. So my opponent in this one was Grandmaster Oliver Barbosa. He's a Filipino Grandmaster that's been in the United States for many years now as a player and coach. And in general, he's a pretty nice guy as well. So yeah, I've known him for some time, and he's always a tough opponent to play, but I was hoping to get off to a good start. So without further ado, let me jump in. Now, I was black, and Oliver opened with knight f3. I went for d5, and then after c4, I played e6, trying to head towards my Queen's Gambit decline type of setups that I've employed so much over the course of this year. And after g3, I actually took a little bit of a think. And the reason I did is because the Catalan has actually been, frankly, an area of weakness for me in 2018. If you have seen the games I played against Gauri Shankar earlier this year and various other opponents, the Catalan has been a problem spot for me. And I really needed to find some improvements in it. Unfortunately, here I didn't actually have many major ideas based upon my previous game, so I was going to try and just play a little bit more stable than I had previously in this line, but I must say I was a little bit disappointed to be facing a Catalan because I felt that I hadn't played so well against it in the past. So anyways, after g3, I went knight f6, bishop g2, bishop e7. Note that if you take the pawn, white typically will recover it right away with queen a4 check. And then the argument in those positions is that white will have 2 central pawns to black's 1 central pawn. And you might say the c5 pawn kind of influences the center. That is kind of true. But typically those structures are a little bit more more playable for white, simply because of the half-open c-file that arises, and also the slightly more mobile pawn structure. And then the other thing you have to think about is when you play d takes e4, you open up the diagonal of the bishop from h1 to a8. So that's also a reason why I have been reluctant to play d takes e4 in Catalan structures, and have usually gone for the closed Catalan. So anyways, after bishop e7, castles, and now d4, and we're back in kind of normal Catalan territory. You might ask, why didn't white go for the d4 move order much earlier? Why'd they wait until after castles? Well, a lot of times if the white player knows you're going to kind of go for a Queen's Gambit decline setup, they're actually going to delay d4 in part to stop the bishop b4 checks that can happen in the main Catalan line. So essentially, if we back up and let's say after knight f6, instead of bishop d2, d4 is played here. Bishop b4 check is actually the most popular move these days, and not bishop e7. The point is that you cause a little bit of disharmony in white's pieces. Typically, they play bishop d2, and then you go back to e7. And the argument is that this bishop on d2 is kind of misplaced and will have to move again. And because of that, white, black argues that that white's setup is a little bit awkward, and that basically black is kind of okay. So instead of that, white basically says, you know what, I'm going to delay playing d4. It's going to stop bishop b4 check and get that type of position. And the downside, if you will, is that by playing this way, you kind of invite black to push forward with d4. But those lines I've always found are a little bit pleasant for white, not from the standpoint that white is better, but they basically have like a reverse Benoni, a tempo up. So if you go like d4 here to try and take the center and basically take the square over because white isn't doing it, typically after castles, c5, e3, knight c6, takes, and d3, I always found these setups awkward for a few reasons. First, white is a tempo up on the normal Benoni lines just because he's playing white. But also, the presence of the pawn on e6 instead of e5 also is a little bit awkward, so sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to reinforce the d4 pawn, and a lot of times white can make use of the e5 square because black hasn't kind of, pinned it down. And then yeah, so basically those features have made me reluctant to play this setup, although it's definitely worthy of study, and perhaps I should take a closer look so that I don't allow individuals to play this English move order to get to the Catalan. But anyways, I played bishop b7, castles, d4, and now I went for knight bd7, and this has been typical for me to go for some type of closed Catalan where I go c6, b6, bishop b7. The problem is that this is not very topical these days, and actually it's not topical because it's actually just better for white, and the reason for that is kind of because white can go for queen c2, sometimes knight c3 or knight d2 and play for the e4 move, and the issue is that when e4 is played, if I take on e4, white has a nice space advantage, but if I don't take on e4, white will go e5, and then my knight is driven to e8 or g4, both of which are not very attractive squares. So because of that, white is typically having an advantage in these lines, and I think some of my opponents were realizing that I was willingly going to these positions pretty much a tempo, pretty much at a not just a tempo down or anything, but just I was going to positions that were clearly worse for me. And in these types of tournaments where everyone's preparing and looking at your games, I pretty much needed to make some adjustment, but probably hadn't quite caught on yet, because after knight bd7, queen c2 is played. Again, I'd faced this against Gary Shankar, I faced this against David Birches, but I didn't really have a major improvement. And after c6, Barbosa played the move knight bd2, and you could see that e4 is pretty much being telegraphed at this point. And it's just another position that's kind of like where I have to kind of defend and play without space, and I was kind of frustrated by that. So I was like, you know what? I'm not going to play the same position that I lost in before, and instead decided to spice it up with the move c5. Now, c5 is extremely controversial and frankly not a great move, but my idea with c5 was that because the knight is on d2 and not on c3, this knight actually doesn't influence the d5 square. And so as a consequence, I thought if I could open up the position, even if I have an isolated pawn and black, even if black has isolated pawn, because this knight is on d2, I thought black would have active play that would justify the setup. And then the other factor was that the knight is blocking the bishop on c1. So you can't like go bishop g5 or bishop f4 and directly or indirectly put pressure on my center. So I thought c5 was a way to kind of spice things up in that way. Now, the thing that's kind of frustrating is that if you think about it, I played c6 and then c5, so I wasted 2 tempe to play the move c5. And that's another drawback behind it, because you can argue, well, maybe you could have used that move somewhere else instead of playing c6, but alas, that's just how it was. So after c5, Oliver played rook d1, and this is actually a very playable move. Now basically arguing that this rook is lining up against this queen on d8, and he's starting to get ready to pressure my hanging pawns and clarify the structure in the center. I was a little bit skeptical of the strength of this move just because it did soften up the f2 square a little bit. Typically, when you have these fan shadowed setups, there's the potential for a bishop or even a queen to get onto the g1 a7 diagonal, and then in conjunction with knight g4, sometimes there are some funny tactics. And so I thought that maybe it would have been better to play another improving move like b3 or even d takes c5 instead of rook d1. But it's not a bad move. So anyways, after rook d1, I played b6, trying to reinforce my center. And now e4 was played anyway. And you can see here, basically, the point is that white is trying to get these essentially closed Catalan types of structures with e5. But he also has the rook lined up on d1, which might be a benefit if the position opens up. And in some lines, the knight actually can come to f1 if the position becomes closed and we get a fixed center. And in that sense, that's actually why rook d1 is quite a reasonable move, because if the center does become fixed with e5, you can have King's Indian attack style counterplay with e5, knight f1, h4, and then like knight h2, knight g4 type of stuff. And that type of stuff is extremely, extremely dangerous because white would have more space and all the minor pieces are on the board, so white would have really good attacking chances on the king side. So very, very interesting plan. Surprisingly, I've actually played this position before, and I actually kind of forgot I had, but there was a game I played at in the Portugal Open, or the Open Portugal event in February that I covered in the Road to Grandmaster series. And my opponent, and it was a round 8 game, my opponent was at FM by the name of Nicolo Napoli, and he played a Catalan type of setup like this. And I actually was, because I've been frustrated by the Catalan, I actually played the same line as in this game over the board, totally improvising. So essentially what that told me is that I've actually struggled with this line for some time, and I actually improvised my way to the same position that I had gotten in February without realizing it. And that's quite remarkable, which also goes to show that I had been trying to mix it up quite a bit in this position. Because after e4 now, I went bishop b7 and invited this e5 move. And again, I've played this actually before in February. So that game is in the Road to Grandmaster series if you want to check it out. And after bishop b7, my idea is that I'm inviting the e5 move, but my argument is that I can actually consider going knight e4 because my bishop and my pawn on d5 are both reinforced that square. And going to e4 is way more attractive than going to e8, where it's going to have a hard time finding a future anytime soon. So, yeah, that was pretty much the concept. After bishop b7, though, white played c takes d5, and after e takes d5, played e5. And now putting the knight on e4 is not as attractive as before, because if I do it now, after knight takes e4, d takes e4, there might be some scenario where the rook's actually lining up against the queen and the knight on d7 is pinned. Whereas in the previous scenario, if e5 is played right away, after knight e4, I could take on d2 first and then play bishop takes d5. And here, trading multiple pairs of minor pieces makes me feel a little bit more comfortable in these types of positions because I don't think the rook is getting to the queen on d8. So essentially, I thought the new circumstance of trading here first and then going e5 kind of made knight e4 less viable. And so because of that, I actually went knight e8. Now, it turns out that knight e4 was playable, and the point is, like, if I go knight e4, after knight takes e4, d takes e4, knight e1, it would seem that this e4 pawn is kind of dropping, but the point is that I do have, decent counterplay, and white is a little bit lacking in coordination with the knight on e1 for the moment, so I'm actually able to gambit a pawn and get some decent compensation. The computer was showing cd4, bishop e4, bishop takes, queen takes, knight c5, and then after this queen trade, it would seem that white's just a clear pawn up, but I can play f6. And the point is that if you take on f6, after bishop takes f6, black's actually quite active here because I'm going to be eyeing the b2 pawn, my rooks are connected, the knight's extremely, extremely active on c5, and I believe white white still has a pawn up, but I believe black has close to full compensation for it in this position. So this is the type of thing that was playable if I did go knight e4. Instead, I went knight e8 and got to this position I'd gotten against Niccolò Napoli in February. And here, Oliver played in a different fashion because he went for knight f1. And after I played c takes d4, he went queen e2. And I believe this was a little bit different than my game in February, but I think his idea was to keep the queen kind of peeled a little bit towards the king side where there could be some attacking chances, and he wanted to prophylactically deal with this rook c8 idea, challenging the queen on the c file. So, interesting concept. There was another option, the one that I was actually kind of concerned about after c takes d4, was sometimes this queen darting over to f5. I thought that in certain lines it could be kind of unpleasant because I would have no real easy way to challenge it, and g6 would kind of weaken some kingside squares. So I always thought the queen coming to f5 was kind of the most dangerous, but queen e2 is also playable. So anyways, after queen e2, I am at positional risk, if you will, because white could potentially go knight. If white gets a few moves, plays knight takes d4, puts his other knight on f3, maybe puts the bishop on f4. My bishop on b7 is kind of blocked out of the game, and my knight on e8 is not very well placed. So positionally, if white gets a few moves and gets all these long-term trumps, I'm in some trouble. But essentially, I thought I'd have to kind of mix it up before that became a distinct possibility, and that's why I now played the move d3. And the idea was to kind of essentially break the coordination or kind of break up white's consolidation in the position with this knight takes d4 and knight e3 and such, and get some tempo for my pieces that would help me develop. So after d3, white played queen takes d3, and now I played the move knight c5. And the idea was to kind of develop with tempo, maybe get this knight to an active square on e4, and just kind of like consolidate my position a little bit before white is truly developed and the rooks are connected. Because really and truly, if white is able to connect their rooks from this setup and still keep the structural trumps in the position, white would actually have a strategically winning position, in my opinion, simply because of the pawn structure. This d5 pawn is an Isolani, and you might say e5 is also kind of isolated, but white has the potential to play f4 and have a really, really strong kingside pawn chain, and as a consequence, essentially would basically be squeezing me with a 4 versus 3, where it's going to be very difficult to mobilize the d pawn. The other factor is that once this knight leaves the f3 square and potentially goes to d4, we have these bishops lined up against each other on the diagonal, as I've spoken about and in previous videos. And basically, when you have bishops lined up against each other on the diagonal, typically one of them is fianchettoed, and usually it's the fianchettoed bishop that's protected by the king that's actually safer, because a lot of times there might be tactics that kind of uncover the weaker bishop. And so in this circumstance, the knight is protecting the bishop on b7 right now. But let's say it wasn't, like a move ago. There are certain tactics where if the d-pawn was pushed, white might have a move like knight g5, threatening checkmate, but also uncovering the bishop on the bishop on g2 against the one on b7. So that's why you kind of have to be careful about the dynamics when two bishops are lined up against each other in diagonal, because tactics do tend to appear. So anyways, those are kind of the long-term worries I had in the position. That's why I wanted to act quickly. So after knight c5, white played queen b1, and I thought this move was a little bit peculiar just because it prevented the rooks from being connected anytime soon. But I did see the dynamic benefit of having the queen lined up against h7, and it kind of plays into what I was just talking about how there could be tactics with knight g5 at a later juncture in the game. And in fact, if white plays a move like h4 to reinforce the g5 square, knight g5 might already be a threat. So, interesting way to play. After queen b1, I played knight c7, trying to fix my knight on e8. That's like the problem piece in my position. And now white went knight e3. And you could just see here that white's position is a touch more pleasant because this f5 square is very, very sensitive. And, if the knight gets to f5, he might get a bishop pair for free. But again, if I cover that square with g6, I'm weakening other dark squares in my position, namely h6 and f6. So essentially, I think it's just a little bit easier to play white's position, even though black is not in terrible shape just yet. So anyways, after knight e3, I went g6, trying to cover up the f5 square. It turns out that it would have been a little bit better to play knight 7 e6, or at least it would have been more playable. It would have been a playable move. And the point is, you allow this knight to f5, but you go rook c8, and you just kind of continue your development. And your argument is that, h4 would be played, but let's say knight takes e7, queen takes e7. Yes, white is up the two bishops, if you will, but here black's rooks are connected, and black might actually be able to play and get counterplay on the light squares with a pawn sacrifice with d4. And all of a sudden, this bishop would be opened up on the diagonal, and, again, because black actually has a lead in development here, it would almost be justified because, those things matter just as much as the two bishops do on some level. So I think part of the problem with g6, the move that I actually played, is that I don't take advantage of any potential trump I have, and I'm creating more weaknesses in my position to stop this knight f5 move. So I think it would have been one of these rare instances, would have been better to actually give up the bishop pair, but we know how I feel about the bishop pair, and that's why it was a difficult decision to just play rook c8 and ignore, or play knight c7, knight 7 e6, rook c8, and ignore the threat of knight f5. So anyways, after g6, white played h4 anyway, kind of building up the attacking prospects on the king side. But I must say that I didn't really think this was super dangerous now, just because the queen is actually blocked out on the diagonal. So it's not just about stopping knight f5. It was also about stopping knight g5 as a potential mating threat. So I did feel okay here. After h4, I went queen d7. And this is probably a mistake. Now, I was thinking, if I connect my rooks, that's a very good thing. Now I can put a rook on d8, a rook on c8, and then maybe free my queen up to do some other stuff. But it actually would have been quite clever, efficient to play the move a5. And the reason for that is that I'd cement this knight on c5 and really stop any ideas of white queenside expansion to take more space in the position. So a5 would have been a very, very useful move to play. It's actually kind of funny that a5 is a good move, because if you saw my video a few days ago against Justin Sarkar, I essentially, in the last round of the Eastern Open in the Road to Grandmaster series, I had a scenario in the ending where I need to play knight c5 and then put the pawn on a5 to cement the knight on that square. And I did it in that game, but a similar theme comes up here, and I didn't do it. So, funny. So anyways, after a5, or after I should have played a5, I instead played queen d7. And here white played the move b3. And I think I underestimated the strength of this move. I thought that white would have a hard time completing his development because the queen and the bishop were in the way here. And I just kind of underestimated that the bishop on this long diagonal would be, very, very efficient. I think in a lot of positions, I was always thinking that the bishop would wind up on f4 or even on h6, just on this diagonal somewhere. But on b2, there will always be some potential ideas with e6 opening up the whole diagonal for white. And he also, from b2, has the potential to really control the d4 square. So I actually think it's a really, really good decision. After b3, it was really a critical position in the game, because essentially, again, if white completes the development, no harm, no foul, white's structure is better short-term and long-term. And so I really had to choose a course of action here that would give me some active and dynamic play, and unfortunately, I didn't choose the right path. The best move in this position is probably rook a d8, or excuse me, not rook a d8, that's what I played. The best move in the position is probably knight 7 e6. And the reason for this is I give myself more coverage of the d4 square, and I also put a piece there before white's knight gets there. Because now if white decides to play knight d4, I could take and then play knight e6. And now I'm able to kind of liberate the d-pawn and push it to d4. And these types of positions, black would actually be completely fine, maybe even better, because the diagonal would open up. There'd be a lot of light squares in the wake of that diagonal opening up. That would be, favorable for black to play on. And I wouldn't be in this kind of passive position. So putting the knight on e6, entertaining d4, but also just getting coverage over the square very quickly would have been the way to go. Instead, I played the move rook a d8, and the issue is I still lack coverage over the d4 square. And after the move bishop b2, it's unclear what my rook is really doing on d8 if I don't get to push d4. And we can kind of plainly see here that d4 isn't actually a threat because there's a lot of pieces on that square. So after bishop b2, I now went knight e4. And again, this was kind of my plan, to kind of put this knight on e4 and to overprotect d5 and argue that my knight on e4 would kind of disrupt white from getting too active on the king side. But the issue is that after the move knight d4, very, very simple, very logical move, now there are some very, very dangerous threats in the position, and I'm in danger of being strategically worse in a few ways, because for starters, there's bishop takes e4 and then some knight discovery, taking advantage of the rook lined up against the queen. But there's also the idea in some positions of my bishop now kind of being a dead piece. Because as long as the d5 pawn is firmly blockaded, or even the e4 pawn is firmly blockaded, because there are some circumstances where bishop takes e4, d takes e4, and the bishop is still blockaded on this diagonal because of my own pawn. But in those types of circumstances where the bishop on b7 isn't playing, I'm basically strategically playing a piece down. And that's not something that, you can tolerate for too long. And so, yeah, I think I kind of missed my chance to kind of control the d4 square and slipped into a relatively passive position. And when I realized that, I tried to get active all of a sudden with the move f5. And unfortunately, this move is actually a really, really bad move because I'm just opening up my own king side and giving white new areas for counterplay. And I really should have just held the fort instead. The best move in the position would have been knight e6, but you can understand, given the possibility for discoveries after bishop takes e4 and d takes e4, that just doesn't seem super attractive, because now the move knight f5 can be played, and, well, white is at least going to get a bishop pair back, but there's also the potential for the knight to anchor itself on d6, and I thought that this was an extremely dangerous position to play. Although upon computer review, I actually could just play queen c7, and after knight d6, I can actually play the move f5. Tricky move to spot from far away, but the point is that e takes f6 is impossible because that would actually hang the knight. And now I'm actually getting some dynamic play connected with f4, and black would actually get quite an active position. So, tough to see from afar that knight e6 and allowing this type of exchanges would be and discoveries on my queen would work out, but that was the way to go. Instead, I played this move f5, and after the simple en passant, again, this d5 pawn is firmly blockaded. The bishop is excellently placed on this diagonal, and this bishop on b7 is not very good, and neither is the knight on c7. Here, after e takes f6, I actually played a losing move, or what should have been a losing move, because really there's only one reasonable way to capture this pawn. And so why don't you pause the video and try to figure out how should black capture on f6. All right, hopefully you paused the video and got a sense of how to actually capture that pawn. It actually turns out that the best way to capture it is to play the move knight takes f6. And the point is that, you don't allow these, discoveries that became the bane of my existence after the move I actually played, because I played the move bishop takes f6, and now after bishop takes e4, all of a sudden there are really, really nasty discoveries based upon the rook lined up against the queen on d7, and I saw these as a potential moves, but I didn't realize just how strong they were until I played this move. And then I was like, oh my gosh, I'm just getting destroyed. White would have still been better, by the way, if I played knight takes f6. White could now just go queen d3. And White's position is kind of picturesque because he's playing effectively against the Isolani on d5. Both bishops are on nice diagonals, and White's rooks are now connected. So once White puts the A rook on c1, really there's no major problems in White's position. But again, I'm not losing or anything, and I could play around my counterplay on the e4 square. So I could consider a move like knight a6 to knight c5, and just get counterplay on e4, and maybe even have some stuff on the half-opened f file. Instead, after bishop takes f6, bishop e4, d takes d4, and knight f5, it kind of dawned on me that tactically my position wasn't holding up. And the main problem was that a lot of positions, knight h6 check was just a decisive idea. I had missed that in certain positions with knight h6, then I can pop out to g4. And in some circumstances, when the light squared bishops are the dark squared bishops are traded, the queen on b1 can assume the diagonal and actually take the place of the dark square bishop and kind of maul my king. So that was kind of the detail that I missed, because after knight f5, I wound up playing knight d5 to kind of shut things down. But other moves were not going to be so helpful either, and there's just too many weaknesses now in the dark squares, especially with these bishops about to be traded off. So after knight d5, White took on f6, and I played rook takes f6, and now knight takes d5, and well, I just showed you the move rook takes d5, but the problem is that after knight takes d5, my position is just lost. And the reason for that is if I play bishop takes d5, there's rook takes d5. And note that I cannot actually recapture the rook on d5 because of knight e7 check. And that fork just proves to be decisive all the time. And so because of that, I'm actually forced to play rook takes f5 and give up my queen, or an exchange, and the position is actually just completely lost. Now, interestingly enough here, Barbosa's technique was not as good as it normally is, because essentially you can see here there's two ways, or there may be three ways that White can proceed. White can actually decide to, get the queen for the rook and knight, which is probably winning, or White can actually try and just win an exchange. And it turns out that one is actually much better than the other. And the move that's much better is actually just going for the exchange with knight e3. And the reason for this is that you actually challenge my queen on d7, but also my rook on d8. And because of that, it means that my queen has to be tied down to this rook on d8. So if I play queen e7 now, White will just trade rooks, take on f5, and then play queen c1. And all of a sudden, White can play queen e3, block my bishop on this diagonal, and also is entertaining queen g5 check, even trading queens. And if the queens come off the board, it's a very easy conversion. So going for the exchange would have been a lot better, because now I can't play queen e7 because of that. And if I play bishop d5 now, after knight takes f5, queen takes f5, it looks like I'm almost getting active with queen f3 and potentially e3. But again, White could play queen c1, step onto the e3 square, and blockade my bishop on d5, which would just be a dead piece if it doesn't have a diagonal to work with, and I'd be a exchange down for absolutely nothing. I could try the move e3 anyway to try and open up this diagonal. It'd be a decent attempt. But now the problem is that after queen takes e3, the queen can't get onto this diagonal right away. And if I try queen h3 to try and give mate, White can actually give the exchange back with a decisive advantage based upon the fact that now my king is too weak, White is already a pawn up, and will probably collect a second pawn momentarily. So basically, it would have been a lot better for white to go for the exchange and not my queen. Instead, white played knight f6 check fairly quickly, and I recaptured and actually had a sliver of hope, because after rook takes f6, rook takes d7, and rook takes d7, all of a sudden my rooks have the potential to double on the f-file, and my bishop also has the potential to actually be opened up on this diagonal if I get to play the move e3. So all of a sudden I thought it wasn't as clear-cut lost as it should have been, because I was actually ready to resign a few moves ago. After the move rook takes d7, white made another mistake, and this actually made the technical task quite difficult, because the move that Barbosa played was actually queen c1. Now, it seems logical to put the queen on a square where it's going to, or on a diagonal where it's going to eye the e3 square, because black really is trying to play e3, and so if white's able to just take that pawn and then, crash in through the king side in the center, white would actually just be easily winning. But the issue with queen c3 is that now I can play the move rook f3, and all of a sudden e3 is a threat again. A better move would have been queen e1, and it's kind of difficult to see, but part of the reason queen e1 is better than queen c1 is because now if I try rook f3, white has rook d1 and can actually trade a pair of rooks, which actually makes the defensive task for me much, much harder, and also kind of alleviates the pressure on white's king, and in particular the f2 pawn. Because now if I take, obviously here e3 doesn't have the same venom, but if I don't take, if I go like rook f7, white's rook can actually infiltrate with rook d8 check. And one of the big issues for me is that it's, essentially this f2 pawn is kind of secure right now, because white is actually totally comfortable giving up the queen for the two rooks and still having a rook versus a bishop in the end. So really this position would just be lost if the white rook got active. Instead, though, after queen c1, I went rook f3, and I did get a little bit excited here because all of a sudden e3 is a legitimate threat to break up white's pawn structure and to get some really, really dangerous checks in with the rook and the bishop working in concert. So after rook f3, white actually played queen c4 check, and after rook df7, you can see I'm really, really trying to pile the pressure on, and white really has only one move to actually stop this e3 idea, or rook takes f2 idea, and it's the move rook e1. And this was actually a good move and well spotted by Barbosa, because you might say, well, what about rook f1 defending the f2 pawn? And that would actually be a huge mistake, because now I have e3, and all of a sudden it's black that is seriously in the driver's seat, because you can't recapture on e3 because of black would remain a piece up after captures on f1. So yeah, all of a sudden it seemed not so clear, but rook e1 was a really, really precise move, and quite a decent one. I played the move rook takes f2, trying to just get this f2 pawn at least, and now white played rook d1. And this is actually extremely strong and just a really, really good move by Barbosa, and really shows strong understanding, because he was in time trouble right now, and I did think I would probably draw this game quite easily with my activity right now. But the whole concept with rook d1 is that now that my rook is on f2 instead of on f3, I'm not actually attacking the g3 pawn, and now white has the opportunity to go on the attack himself, which was not the case a move ago. Note that in the previous position, before rook takes f2, white started with rook d1. Now again I'd have this e3 move, and the point is that I'd have rook takes g3, and all of a sudden in this type of position, white would be in real trouble based upon the bishop and the rook working in concert to deliver serious, serious threats against the white king. But with my rook on f2, even though I've won a pawn, I don't have any threats for the time being, and this makes my position really, really critical. I played h5, giving myself an escape square on h7, because rook d8 check and something like queen d4 threatening mate on h8 was a real threat, and also threatening to pick up the rook for the exchange, or the two rooks for the queen. So essentially after rook d1, if I played a nothing move like a5, now after rook d8 check, king g7, and queen d4, I'm losing. I get to a losing position because I give up my two rooks for the queen, and I'm down in exchange. And of course, if I have to, pin myself with a move like rook f6, this position is just lost because material will start to drop. And if I put the other rook on f6, I'm just simply too passive. And frankly, this might even be an eternal pin because I don't see any brilliant way to get out of it. So instead, I play move h5 just to, give my king the h7 square. And after rook d7, white actually achieves his desired aim, which is actually to get rid of one of the rooks, nullify my attacking chances, and then start to press himself. I now played rook f1 check, and after queen takes f1, rook takes d7, we have this endgame on the board that's actually really interesting because right now the material is technically equal. I'm up a pawn and then have the rook and the bishop, and so the 9 points to the 9 that the queen is worth, but white is significantly better in this position, and the computer actually evaluates it as a winning position. And the reason for that is because it's very, very difficult to mobilize my e-pawn, pretty much impossible. And white can really play on the dark squares around my bishop and try to get very active and try to deliver some checkmates. And then the presence of the b3 and a2 pawns over here give white the potential to create some type of weakness or pass pawn on this side of the board if I blunder something. And so it's still a very, very dangerous position for me, but I did feel that I could probably hold it with best play. And what followed was actually an extremely, extremely long affair because this game would actually last another 90 moves from this part of the game. So I'm actually not going to go over all of the moves because a lot of it is just about the themes rather than like move by move something drastic changing. But I will kind of like summarize what is happening and then point out the critical moments. So I do want to say, though, that the computer, again, evaluates the decision as winning for white, or at least my engine did, but I'm not so sure. I think it's actually closer to a draw than a win, and I think it might be a fortress type of position. You'll certainly see later that that there were fortress possibilities, but very, very interesting to study whether it's actually a win or a draw. Anyway, so after rook takes d7, white went queen f6. That's a good move, eyeing the g6 pawn. And I went rook g7, and it forces me to go passive. And I think that's the other reason this is so difficult for black to defend, just because I kind of have to defend passively. So after rook g7, queen e6 check, king h7, and king f2. Now the king enters the fray. Note that it was very important for the queen to get off of the F line before he moved the king in, because there were some ideas of rook f7 earlier. So now the king is going to get to the center without being harassed. I went bishop h6. I kind of recognized that this e4 pawn is probably going to drop, so I decided to just give it up right away because it would give my bishop more scope along the long diagonal. So that was why I did that. After queen takes e4, I went bishop c8. And now I'm putting my bishop on a diagonal where it has scope, and then I activate my rook. And you can see here that I don't have any weaknesses. All my pawns are protected, and my rook seems pretty active. My bishop is also protected. So I thought that if I kept everything protected, I have had a good chance at holding. And yeah, I actually gave myself an opportunity because we would shuffle. The king would get in, but even here, there was no way for the king to actually enter because in this position, the king could never cross towards the 7th rank. So I was not really at risk as long as the king couldn't cross. There were some circumstances where if the king got to b8 and the queen was able to attack the a7 pawn, there could have been some queen takes a7 sacrifices. So just to illustrate, let's say I play, let's say something like this. Okay, queen e3 happened. Let's say king d6 happened, and I allow the king to b8, and then I don't know. I'm shuffling right now, but just trying to give you a sense of what I'm thinking. So let's say this type of thing happened. There could be some dangers if the bishop, okay, the bishop can attack the a4 pawn, so even here it's not a problem, but let's say it's like this. There could be some issues where potentially the two connected passers would be winning because the black king would be too far away to really contest the pawns. And note that I don't really even have a chance to push my pawns on the king side. But so basically, my whole point was that if I keep the rook on the 7th rank and allow the white king to cross like that, I probably would be fine. And that turned out to be the case. So I shuffled. There's a lot of shuffling. And then Oliver actually played a5, trying to trade the pawns and maybe create the weakness on a7. And I was happy to trade because it meant that, you know, now there's only one pawn left on that side. And again, I thought there wasn't any real way to make progress. And even here, you could see the king is trying to cross, but really doesn't get that opportunity. And so here was the other critical try that white had, was to actually try to play king g5 and queen f6 check, almost like a la Nigel Short, trying to get a king walk on the dark squares and then checkmate me. And that was something that I was kind of worried about, and I really underestimated a key important detail in these positions that will come up a little bit later. And it's the details that white can't actually attack a rook on g7 and the pawn on g6 at the same time. And it's really, really important for me to understand this, because essentially, if I didn't know this, I would have been able to hold the blockade now and been able to shuffle, and my opponent would have offered me a draw. The point is that I play bishop g4, but the point is if I go rook g7 and after king g5, bishop g4, if king f6, I just move the rook away, and there's no way, or I'll put it on d7 where it's protected, and there's no way to make progress and give mate on g7 because the rook is just covering the square. And then as soon as you play queen e8 attacking the g6 pawn, I just go rook g7. And again, the major point is that the queen, in conjunction with the king, can attack f6. They can't attack g7 and g6 at the same time. There's no square that the queen can go to where it can attack both at the same time. So I just defend either one and then shuffle with my bishop. But I just missed this detail, and I think it was this was the main reason why I wound up actually not holding this game, because I just consistently missed that idea. So anyways, we shuffled more. There was more shuffling. The king darted around again. I was actually counting the 50 move rule, but and amazingly, I was one move away from the 50 move rule, because the king had now darted around several times, and we'd played about 5.5 hours by this point. And then here, I was counting, and I was actually at move 48 or 49, and then here, Oliver played the move b6, still trying to keep the game going. And I was like, oh my God, why isn't this over? And after a takes b6, white played king g5 and tried this one last shot. And again, the idea here is that there's queen h6 check as a threat, trying to pick off g6 and get the king in like that. But again, the key idea is that I don't even have to go bishop f5. I can just go rook g7. And again, as long as I'm defending g6 and stopping h6, white can attack both g7 and g6 at the same time. So now the only way to try to progress would be king f6, and then I move the rook away, and then if they try to attack g6, I put the rook on g7. Basically, with my rook on g7, I defend the g6 pawn, and I defend any queen h6 checks, and that's the key. Instead, I still didn't realize this and played bishop f5. And after queen e8, I did go rook g7. And after king f6, I shuffled here. And it's still a draw. But here I made a huge mistake with rook g8. Instead, if I just play bishop f5, I hold things together and just do the same type of shuffling. But I played the move rook g8 here after queen e4 in a bit of a panic. I'd been defending on increment for some time, and after rook g8, I kind of just broke. And the problem here is that after queen e7 check, my position is nearly critical. And now there's only one way to hold this position, and unfortunately, I miss it. So why don't you pause the video here and with black to move and hold, try to figure out the right way to go with the king here. All right, hopefully you got a chance to figure out which move is better with the king. The move that holds is king h8, going passive on the back rank. And the idea, again, maybe you've seen it because I'm kind of beating a dead horse now, is that now if the king goes to g5, I go rook g7, the queen moves away somewhere, and then I go king h7, and again establish the same blockade where my rook is guarding g7, and I can shuffle at will. Unfortunately, I played the move king h6, wary of this king g5, king h6 idea for white. I'm missing the fact that I can just play rook g7, and then set my king up to h7. And here the position is actually lost because of the very simple queen f7. And all of a sudden, I can't hold everything together because the king is actually kind of cut off right now, and my rook is stuck having to defend the g6 pawn because of mate. But now there's no square on the g file where the rook's actually protected. So I was so devastated here and was kind of shaking my head and just distraught because I defended for like 90 moves, 80 or 90 moves, and managed to blunder right at the end. Because now after queen f7, there's no way to avoid queen takes g6 without giving up material. So I win bishop e6 just to divert the king or the queen away. But after king takes e6, rook g7, and queen f8, white is actually now just up a queen for rook, and there's no blockading chances because white can establish a kind of zugzwang position with the king invading via g5. So I could resign here, but it hadn't really sunk in what I had done completely, so I played a few more moves, and after king h7, king f6, rook b7, queen e8, rook g7, queen takes b5, rook a7, and queen d3, the position is actually completely lost, and basically white has a really nice breakthrough idea with g4 and h5, which actually just wins the game. Note that the queen on d3 also holds rook a6 check, which is an important thing to note, because there are some positions where you could kind of mess this up. Like, let's say the queen went to b2 for some reason. I could go, let's say white makes a few bad moves. Now, if I get in rook f5, let's say more than a few bad moves. Let's say queen b2, queen d2. Now rook f5 check, king e6. This isn't the easiest position in the world to win because the king is actually cut off from the action. And so if the queen can't win the game by itself, it needs the king to participate. So this is the type of position I was kind of hoping for with these blockades. But the really nice move queen d3 actually prevents me from checking horizontally, and essentially, this means that that I have to defend the g6 pawn passively with rook g7. And now white just played the move g4, which basically is a very, very simple breakthrough that allows h5 and opens up the game. I took h takes g4, and then after h5, you could see that now white's just threatening h takes g6. And so I went king h6, and then after h takes g6 anyway, I resigned because now all that's left for white is to get the rook or to get the queen to the h file and deliver checkmate. And there's just mate in 2 with queen e3 and queen g5, or queen b1 and queen h1. And so after 100 and how many moves? 124 moves, I threw in the towel. Tough game. I must say I was really upset by this game, and it was just really difficult to keep my wits about me because I hadn't lost a game in a little while. I mean, I'd had a few back-to-back successful tournaments where I was playing much weaker opposition at the Eastern Open and at the Washington Chess Congress, but I hadn't lost a FIDE-rated game for over 10 games, and I was just trying to keep that momentum going, and it felt like I did so well to defend and then threw it all away right at the end, and that's always a tough thing to swallow. To add insult to injury, the next round was actually supposed to start 2 minutes after this game ended, and I just played a 124-move game, was totally exhausted, and I had to gather my wits about me and try to move on, and that's very difficult to do. So I actually, after the game, I took a walk around the block outside. I tried to clear my head, and then I had to be back at it again. So that's the nature of, playing 2 games a day sometimes is, if you have a long game, you have to kind of clear everything and then, try again. So anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.